Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. You're either watching this video because you're in my class or you stumbled across it online. If you find it helpful, hit like and subscribe so you can get more videos. If you're in my class, these videos are intended for you. Learn the material the way that I teach it. If you're not in my class, you may have more detail, a different way of learning that your instructor wants to cover. These videos are for me to provide a basic and simplified explanation of the concepts we're covering in anatomy and physiology. This video is the last in a series of videos for our very first lab test in Part 1A and P. We're going to be doing the skin model. I am not doing the skin slide on the lab test, so you can forget the skin slide on the list of things to know. For the skin model, there's going to be 10 things that I could ask about the skin model, and I'm going to go over those with you. I'm very aware that there's a bright hot spot from our projector right there, but I am projecting onto the board for a reason, so I can write on it. In a little bit, I'll lower the screen and I'll point out the structures without all the writing. But I wanted to teach it to you looking at the model blown up with the projector, okay? So now, we have been studying everything from the language of anatomy, proximal, distal, superior, inferior, medial, lateral, the regional terms, cephalon, cervical, thoracic, abdominal, all of that. We've gone over the body cavities, the serous membranes, the organs, the levels of organization, the 9 abdominal pelvic regions. We've gone over the parts of the cell, all the organelles in the cell. We've gone over some tissues. The last thing we need to cover for this first lab test is the skin slide and skin model. And again, I'm not doing the slide on the test. Now, your skin is both an organ and part of a larger organ system. Now, as you know, atoms come together to form molecules and chemicals. Those come together to form organelles. Organelles form cells. Cells form tissues. Tissues form organs, and organs form organ systems. We've been going through the levels of organization. Well, this model represents both an organ, your skin, and we don't think of the skin as an organ like we do the liver, the spleen, or the brain, but it is an organ because it's made up of different tissues, as you'll see in a moment. And it's an organ system because it has all of these smaller structures embedded in it, which are also organs. They're made up of different tissues that perform specific functions. The skin is an organ, excuse me, I have this frog in my throat, as you've seen in a few videos, and it's part of an organ system called the integumentary system. So, there's 10 things I want to cover on this model, and let me go over them with you. The first thing I want to point out to you is this, okay? Our skin is made up of only 2 layers, and that's important. There's a third layer associated with the skin, but it's not part of the skin. If I ask you to ID the skin layers, this is what I want you to know. This very top layer here, there's kind of a basement membrane that would be running along right here. You see this sort of purplish grayish looking layer and this dark pink layer. That top layer is called the epidermis. Derm means skin and epi means uppermost. Let me make sure this is all showing up on my screen and my phone hasn't died. Yeah, we're still there. We're good. So, all the way across the top, if I say ID this layer, you would say epidermis. This thick pink layer here is called the dermis. And those 2 layers together make up our skin. There's a third layer that's associated with the skin, but it is not part of the skin. And this layer is called the hypodermis. Hypo always means below, so if you've ever heard of a hypodermic needle, it's a needle that goes all the way deep into the hypodermis. So those are the 3 layers, 2 layers of the skin and a third layer associated with the skin. If I ask you on a lab test, ID the layer, epidermis. ID the major layer, dermis. ID the layer, hypodermis. Now, over here, I'm going to ask you to ID the tissue in the layers. Each layer is made up predominantly of a specific type of tissue, some of which we've studied. This layer here is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. So, the epidermis is mostly stratified squamous epithelial tissue or stratified squamous epithelium. Our skin is a little thinner where it's hairy, where we have hair sticking out, and it's thicker where we don't have hair like the palm of the hands, but nonetheless, it's all stratified squamous epithelium. Now, the layer that's made up of the dermis is really several layers mixed in. There is some areolar connective tissue, and there's a stuff called dense, irregular connective tissue, which we have not studied. So there's a lot of loose connective or areolar connective tissue and some dense irregular mixed in, and we're not going to see that. The type of tissue that makes up the hypodermis is adipose connective tissue. So now there's 6 questions I could ask. ID the layer, epidermis. ID the layer, dermis. ID the layer, hypodermis. If I say ID the type of tissue found in this layer, the answer is stratified squamous epithelium. If I say identify one of the tissues found in this layer, you can say areolar connective tissue. And ID the tissue found in this layer, that would be adipose connective tissue. Now, embedded in our skin are these structures that have hairs sticking out of them. If I ask you to ID that structure, that would be called a hair follicle. Now, I'm not going to make you identify the hair shaft inside the hair follicle, just ID the hair follicle, okay? Now, on parts of our body, when these little muscles contract that make the hair stand up or give you goosebumps, those little muscles are called an Erector Pili muscle. And I'm going to put a little AP on both of these so I don't have arrows going everywhere. But that little structure that I labeled AP stands for Erector Pili muscle. Okay? Pelo means hair if you speak Spanish, and pili means the same thing. So those are Erector Pili muscles attached to these hair follicles. Okay? And they make your hair stand up or give you goosebumps. There are 2 major glands in our skin that we're going to talk about. There's a few, but these are the major ones. One of the glands is usually attached to or associated with hair follicles. And if we don't slice it open, it looks like a bunch of little grapes hanging off here. Or on this one, they sliced part of it open, and you see this yellow fluid, which is an oil called sebum, that seeps out into your skin and prevents it from drying and cracking. It makes your skin oily. Because the substance secreted by these glands is called sebum, I'm going to put a little S on both of these structures, or on all 3 of these. This one, you see it on both sides of the hair follicle. That little S is going to stand for sebaceous gland. And that's a sebaceous gland, and that's a sebaceous gland. They secrete a stuff called sebum. The last thing I want you to see on here are these little coiled tubes that go to the surface called sweat glands. So I'm going to put an SW on those. And this is actually a sweat gland, but there are miracrine and apocrine sweat glands, and we're not going to get into difference in them. But all of those structures that I labeled with an SW is going to stand for a sweat gland. Now on a lab test, I'm going to ask you this. Please identify the layer at the pointer, epidermis. Identify the layer of tissue at the pointer, or the layer of skin at the pointer, dermis. Please identify this thick yellow layer, hypodermis. Please identify the tissue found in this layer, stratified squamous. Identify the tissue found in this layer, areolar. There's some dense irregular, but just put areolar connective tissue. And identify the tissue found in this layer, that would be adipose. Identify the structures at the pointer, you would write sweat gland. Identify the structure at the pointer, you would write sebaceous gland. And identify these structures at the pointer, those would be hair follicles, and these would be Erector Pili muscles. So those are the 10 things that I will ask you for on this model that you should be able to know about. In lecture, we'll talk about the functions of each layer and the functions of all the organs and what they do and how they help our skin do its job. Now, what I'm going to do, since this is all written over and you should have the abbreviations, let me see if it looks okay through my camera before I'm completely satisfied. Yeah, I think you should be able to see that. You may have to magnify your screen. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. It does cut some of the writing off just a hair, but I think you can see everything pretty well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the screen down, and I'm going to do it one more time without all the writing on it. Okay? ID the layer, epidermis. ID the layer, dermis. ID the layer, hypodermis. ID the tissue found in this layer, stratified squamous epithelium. ID the tissue found in this layer, areolar connective tissue. ID the tissue found in this layer, adipose connective tissue. ID the structure at the pointer, those are all hair follicles. ID the structure at the pointer, sebaceous glands. ID the structure at the pointer, erector pili muscle. ID the structure at the pointer, sweat glands. Anything else on there we're not going to worry about, okay? So, I hope you learned this material. I hope you learned it well. I'm going to put the screen back up so that you can see the labels if you like. I hope you had as much fun as I did, and I hope you're ready for the first lab test. It is a lot of material. It's not super difficult, but it requires you to spend a lot of time learning this material. I've delayed some of this stuff so that you could focus on the early stuff so that I can release the material over time. You got 1 week to learn all this, roughly about a week, maybe a little bit more. I hope you learn all this material well enough that you're ready to make A's on your first lab test. Okay? I hope you had as much fun as I did, and I'll see you for lab test 2. Thanks for watching.